Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final installment of the Black Studies Center, African American and Diaspora Study at the University of Wyoming's Black History Month program. We've had a host of events with a host of topics. My name is Frederick Douglass Dixon. I'm only Dixon on payday, so I'm Frederick Douglass all the time. And we began this entire process by wanting to not commemorate or wanting to celebrate, but reckon with the 100th anniversary of the death of Black Wall Street. So that was the theme, 100 years after the death of Black Wall Street and what has become of America today. So very intently, we discussed the death of Black Wall Street, the social conditions that created Black Wall Street. We used it in this manner. Ex post facto, what came before the event, ex post facto, what came as a direct result of. So you saw, if you were with us, you saw that we talked about Birth of a Nation. You saw that we talked about a video before they died. You saw that we talked about Rosewood. And in between, we had some very interesting conversations about vaccines, mistrust in the Black community. And tonight, we continue in that vein to challenge the mainstream narrative, to go about adding to, dismantling, disrupting, and interrupting the mainstream narrative. So tonight we will have a conversation that I think that you will find very interesting with great guests. But I want to go to how the Black Studies Center has become part of the fabric, if you will, the tapestry of the University of Wyoming. We're in a very infantile stage. This is our first semester, and we have had some huge things happen. And I work with some really great people. Toby Thompson, you can't see, and we thank him dearly. But I'm about to introduce to you all our Director of Community Engagement. And these are the young people that I work with. And I want you to understand that I do understand the idea and the paradigm of the youngest being the most important. So we live by these paradigms. We don't just talk about these paradigms. So thinking about what happened this semester, thinking about what happened during Black History Month, we are at a point right now to have this conversation that we're going to have tonight. We had a very horrific event, February 15th, where we were bombed with racist and pornographic material, but it only showed us how much and how important our work here is at the Black Studies Center at the University of Wyoming, which is, if you think about it, kind of oxymoronic. A Black Studies Center at the University of Wyoming, what else could be oxymoronic? Jumbo shrimp. Let me see what else. Honest politician. Let me see what else. Third twin. But how about this? A good Christian slave owner. So when we look at this, we look at it directly. So I'm going to quickly introduce to you tonight's host, Timberly Vogel, who is the Director of Community Engagement. And in many ways, she's the engine that makes us go. I'm sure that you will enjoy this conversation. Feel free to use the chat. Feel free to become part of this conversation, which is very timely and timeless. So right on to you, Timberly Vogel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon, and thank you for everything you've done to get the Black Studies Center going and allowing us to host amazing webinars like this, and I'm excited for the future that is to come with these. And thank you everyone, panelists and attendees, for coming tonight. My name is Timberly Vogel. I am the Director of Community Engagement within the Black Studies Center at the University of Wyoming, and I will be moderating tonight's discussion revolving challenging police perspectives surrounding the controversy of defunding the police. And this is a co-hosted Think and Drink with the Humanities Institute. So just to be sure, in case you see Kenneth up at the top, we appreciate all that they've contributed to the Black Studies Center as well. So before I get into introducing our panel tonight, I would like to make a land acknowledgement. The Black Studies Center acknowledges that the University of Wyoming, as well as the city of Laramie, occupies ancestral and traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and Shoshone indigenous peoples, along with other native tribes who call the Great Basin and the Rocky Mountain region home. We recognize, support, and advocate alongside indigenous communities and individuals who live here now and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. The Black Studies Center stands in solidarity with the original inhabitants of this land, as well as to those who continue to work for and advocate for Indigenous rights on it today. And for those of us who are not tuning in from Laramie, we encourage you to identify the native lands and languages in which in your area and acknowledge their culture, history, and contributions. So now I will introduce our wonderful set of guests. And again, I have to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for being able and willing to join us tonight for, as Dr. Dixon said, this extremely timely and important conversation. So our first panelist is Jael Karandi, who was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and moved to the US when she was just 1.5 years old. She's currently a senior at the University of Minnesota within the Carlson School of Management, studying finance and marketing with minors in leadership and business law. This summer, Jael completed an internship with Microsoft in their finance organization. So Jael's passionate about creating a better world for future generations. She served as the first Black undergraduate student body president and vice president at the University of Minnesota, and she currently serves as the ranking representative to the Board of Regents and chairs of the student representatives to the Board of Regents. So Jael is passionate about racial justice and ensuring that our institutions are held accountable to their so stated values. For her work, Jael was honored to be featured in a number of news and media publications and has spoken across the nation at notorious universities such as Notre Dame and Columbia and Princeton. She's also worked with the WCL chapter at the American Law School in DC and the NAACP on different toolkits and for student organizers. So thank you, Jael, for joining us and bringing all of your experience and expertise to this panel. Next, I'll be introducing Lieutenant Kevin Lee. Lieutenant Kevin Lee graduated from Aurora University with a bachelor's in law enforcement management, and he started his career in law enforcement in 1994 as a police officer and is now the police lieutenant at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District in Chicago, Illinois. So thank you, Mr. Lee, for joining us all the way from Illinois. And next we have Mike Samp, who is a veteran member of the University of Wyoming Police Department. He served as assistant chief since 2009 and is now the chief of the University Police Department. He's been with UW Police since 1997 and graduated from Chardon State College with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. After working as a UW patrol officer, he was promoted to sergeant in 2000, and he became a detective in the force in 2008 and was named assistant chief in 2009. And during his time with UW-PD, Michael Samp has developed and supervised the field training officer program and was a member of the Laramie Police Department Special Response Team. And he's also served as a guest instructor at the Wyoming Law Enforcement Academy. So thank you, Mike Samp, for joining us today. And again, bringing your knowledge of law enforcement and specifically Laramie to this panel. I think it'll be very beneficial and valuable to what we have to say tonight. Next, Aaron Appelhans, Sheriff Aaron Appelhans grew up in Denver, Colorado, and later moved to Laramie to pursue a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. And during his undergrad, he was a part of the student organization Black Leaders that led to the establishment of what we know today as Martin Luther King Days of Dialogue. And after working through UW's admissions department, his passion for helping people led him to join the University Police Department. And through his 10 years with the UW Police Department, he served as a crime prevention officer, a detective, and finally a sergeant supervising daily activities and patrols. And in recent news, in December of 2020, Sheriff Appelhans was appointed to the sheriff's position within the Albany County Sheriff's Department, where he currently serves as Wyoming's first African-American sheriff. So thank you, Sheriff Appelhans, for joining us today. And I hope you're situating into your new, very new position calmly. And we appreciate you being able to contribute to this panel tonight. And last but not least, our guest, Miss Amanda Pittman, graduated from the University of Wyoming within the anthropology department. And after her undergrad, she worked within the Albany County Coroner's Office for 4 years, where she briefly served as interim county coroner. Her experience with death investigation is what drove her to reach out to Albany County for Proper Policing, which is a nonprofit grassroots organization within Laramie dedicated to asking for and lobbying for more accountability and transparency within Albany County. And so thank you, Amanda. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. And I just wanted to start tonight. Obviously, I read through your bios and can talk a little bit about your careers and where you are today, but I would really love if we could start this panel off with what either in your personal lives, your career lives, your educational lives led you to being willing and seeing value in having this conversation today, because I think it's extremely easy, maybe pre-summer 2020, to look at police reform and terms as defunding the police and sort of brushing them off. But as we all are here today and can see, this has been something that it's virtually impossible to disregard. And so if, I think we can start with Amanda, just talking about what led you and inspired you to being where you are today in terms of police reform, and what brought you here to seeing value in this conversation.
Sorry, let me unmute. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I would say it's probably a confluence of a whole lot of things in my life that's kind of brought me toward this path. And for everyone who is on the path towards defunding and or abolition, I think it's definitely a growing experience. But a couple things. I would say that, like, working through the coroner's office and seeing how, from my perspective, that the coroner's office ought to be a check and a balance on law enforcement, and seeing in a lot of ways how the funding and the abilities there don't necessarily reflect that. And then also through my own experiences with mental health, and then also having volunteered at like the downtown clinic and seeing some of the needs and lacking needs that are in our community, and looking through that lens toward what can we do that helps affect and improve the root causes of some of the quote unquote problems that we're trying to solve with law enforcement, where we are looking at symptoms a lot of times rather than looking at, sorry, I have a cat, rather than looking at actual root causes of these problems or these issues or these conflicts in our society. And seeing if we can't improve people's material conditions and lives in a way that that makes it so that we have fewer conflicts and less need for policing in society. And then, sorry. And if we can do that, then we can, hopefully we can move forward. But yeah, through working and living in Laramie for quite a while, I've seen that there is need that's not necessarily being met. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement in many, many areas. So I think I'll leave it there, but there's obviously a lot that we can all talk about.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And Kevin, if you'd like to follow up with, oh, camera just went off. Maybe not. Mike, would you be willing to follow up with that and just sort of share your experiences, perspective, and what brought you here today?
Certainly. I think I'm unmuted now. So I've been fortunate enough throughout my career. I spent the early part, the first almost 6 years, working next to a reservation, and working with some of the indigenous population in Southwest South Dakota. And that really, from a law enforcement perspective, started me down a path of certainly being interested not only in the cultural change, but the impact law enforcement has within those groups. And certainly during my time here at the University of Wyoming, I've been fortunate enough to see some very good things, some things that were very bad, some issues that, for example, bringing the Black 14 back and being recognized maybe 50 years too late, But what I found is being quite impactful on me personally, as a human being, frankly. And so that said, I've always seen a high level of professionalism and integrity within law enforcement, but I've also known the profession to be very resistant to change, and therefore certainly open to dialogue like this, and making sure that we're reviewing all options to make sure we're truly serving the communities that we are hired to serve.
Thank you for that. And Kevin, sorry, I handed you the mic and then your camera went out. Would you like to share your perspective of what brought you here today? And
Absolutely. I was having difficulty, and I'm still having difficulty hearing the other panelists. So I was trying to see if I could find a way to turn the volume up. But this is the type of conversation that has to take place. It's long overdue. I have a unique perspective as one of the other panelists as being Black and being a law enforcement officer. So I've seen both the good and the bad in the profession. I think it's one of the most noble professions you can be a part of. However, there are so many warts that we have, and we're resistant to having even conversation to change. It has to be something that we're open to now. So this is hopefully the beginning of the opportunity for us to not resist and not feel like it's an attack, because we can tweak the things that we're doing, and understand first and foremost that we're not overseers, but we are public servants. And if we approach it that way, maybe we can get some change, some substantive change into what's going on in law enforcement.
Awesome, thank you for that. And Jael, would you like to follow up and share your experience?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So about 30 years almost coming up for the anniversary of what happened with Rodney King, right? I wasn't even born at that point or really saw anything like that. But unfortunately, things like that aren't far in between from our society right now, right? These are still the things that we continuously see over and over, in the same outrage, the same exclamation that happens, and then we follow up with almost little to no action, right? It's this really plethora, this whole roller coaster of feelings, and nobody ends up actually seeing meaningful change from it. And so a reason I think that I always entered into this is there's so many people that came before me, activists and people that were pushing for these reforms and constantly hitting these brick walls, and they would push and get a little and hit the brick wall. And we'd go over and over again. And I think what people fail to realize is we're talking about people's livelihoods. Sometimes people talk about this issue as if it doesn't actually touch people's lives, right? We talk about it very objectively in this kind of scheme of things, of lives being lost almost as some sort of casualty being normalized. So when it came to things like Trayvon Martin and things that happened in Minneapolis and Alton, certainly, and just kept going on and on and on. And the adversity of Ahmaud Arbery just happened, right? That wasn't necessarily police brutality, but we saw what happened to a Black man. And so these things keep happening. We saw it happen to Breonna Taylor, and Black women are continuously ignored. And I came into a position of being like, when I'm in a position to say something and do something and I feel that power, I'm going to. And being the student body president, this past spring, I had the opportunity after the murder of George Floyd, but long before that, we had our own issues with our campus police. And I kept asking our administration, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Students are continuously telling that the very people that are supposed to be protecting them, they feel like they need protection from. And when you hear these type of things and you objectively ignore it and you keep saying, enough is enough. Right? There is no longer a time to wait. There's no longer a time to dilly-dally. There's no longer a time for us to continuously sit here and say these issues, well, on the aggregate level, we're still doing a good job. It's not about the aggregate, right? Lives are not aggregated. We don't get to aggregate deaths. We don't get to aggregate how much people matter. So at the end of the day, for me, it was a matter of saying, if I'm in a position to do something, if I'm in a position to say something, I'm going to, because what's to say it isn't me next, right? What's to say it isn't the person right next to me? Why do I have to wait until it touches my life or touches somebody close to me for me to say something? I'm a Black person living in America, so therefore my life is threatened, and therefore that means all of our lives are threatened who are Black people, and therefore this fight is mine just as much as it is anyone's.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for being here. And Aaron, you want to follow up?
Echoing on what everybody else said, and for me to be involved with it, being in a position where I can affect change is really, what attracted me to it. Especially in my current position, to be able to see both the good and bad in law enforcement, and then be put in a position where, you know, I can affect change, definitely at a local level, and hopefully at a broader level as well, and you know, affect my community in a positive way.
Awesome, thank you. So I think it's important, in the title of this webinar, Challenging Police Perspectives Surrounding the Controversy of Defunding, I think it's absolutely necessary that we get everyone's insight into what defunding the police means to you as an individual, and what do you think when you hear those slogans. And Kevin Lee, if you want to start with that.
My idea of defunding the police is not taking money from the police department arbitrarily. I think that we as police officers, we're called to scenes and we're ill-equipped to deal with them. So if we could take some of the money that is used in law enforcement and maybe target that in other areas, social services that are going to help with the mental health issues that officers are impacted with when they're out on patrol. There has to be a better way to spend the public monies, because we haven't been effective at it yet. We're not gonna do it as the police. We're gonna have to have some partnerships to make sure this thing gets turned around.
And Jael, if you want to follow up with your definition of defunding, what it means to you.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes I hear this term and I feel like it's become somewhat of a social trend to hear defund the police. So I sometimes struggle with it. But what I could say is, when I talk about policing and I'm talking about how we allocate resources, I'm talking about policing in all of its forms. I'm also talking about in K through 12 and how our students are suspended, right, and policed in those forms. I'm talking about policing in its totality. So when you're looking at talking about defunding or maybe moving resources, it's to say, what is the actual priority here? Right? What are we actually, the human capital that we have in a police department, does that actually align with the effectiveness that they're having in our communities? And the short answer is no. Right? The very clear answer is no. But for so long, we've continued to funnel all this money, taxpayer dollars, into saying we're, strengthening our police force, because people tend to think that the representation of the police means safety, when in fact, so many communities are saying over and over and over, it actually is the opposite, right? I feel threatened by the police. I don't want the police in these areas. So I think it's to say, when we're talking about moving resources, similar to what Mr. Lee just said about what is the actual need here. And if the police are, which they've demonstrated over and over, are ill-equipped to deal with the situations, why aren't we funneling resources to the areas that are, right? When we look at our schools, look at how severely defunded they have been over the years. Look at how severely ill-equipped our teachers are, our mental health counselors are, our social counselors are to deal with our students, because we don't have the financial resources that are being allocated there. Instead, we have resources officers who are arresting students in their classrooms. So I think it's to look at and say, what exactly is the need here? And is that actually satisfied by the police? I actually believe in a whole reimagination of policing and public safety, because what we have right now was invented and created to be slave catchers, right? That's how policing started. And I think some people are so afraid to talk about it, but it's a fact, it exists. So what do you do now that shows that you have shifted your mindset? To hold a mindset that is over centuries old is actually quite embarrassing. At what point do we say we're keeping up with the times and doing what's right for our community?
Thank you. And Aaron, would you like to add anything, what your perspective is on defunding?
My perspective on defunding the police is similar to Kevin's. Is how can we better police our community, and then how do we use those resources available that come either from municipality level, county level, state level, and allocate it to the things that our community needs. And then how does police, how can we find a better way for police to partner with different either community organizations, mental health organizations, to where we can have a better response, and if not even a response at all from law enforcement, to deal with that situation, that person, that individual that's in crisis.
Thank you. Amanda, would you like to share what your perspective of defunding the police is?
Yeah, so I definitely think it's redirecting police resources to the services and resources that can help people thrive in society. And so making sure that there are material resources and in those communities, and making sure that they are accessible without having to go through the criminal justice system in order to get them. Essentially, it's looking at the problems that we've assigned to the police to solve post hoc, after the fact, trying to prevent those kinds of problems. And what kinds of problems are we thinking of? It's the issues that we consider order. It's if people are unhoused, that is something that is considered disorderly in society. So those people might end up getting arrested, or in a lot of cases, and locally sent with a bus ticket out of town. What would be better in our society would be making sure that they have housing preventatively. Looking at food insecurity, looking at education, making sure that people who are in domestic violence situations have resources and safety and are able to get out of those situations early. Because honestly, police aren't able to solve all of the problems. They aren't able to solve all of the crimes. And even if they can, that doesn't necessarily make somebody whole in the end. So I think that criminalizing all of the problem, or all of the so-called problems, we essentially can't criminalize our way out of whatever obstacle we see. We also need to look fundamentally at what are our priorities. I think, as Jael mentioned, what are our priorities? We're spending a lot of money on criminalizing drug use, and is that where we need to be spending our money? Even with patrol and traffic stops, drug use is something that can always be looked for. And is that really what we need to be looking for, is possession of a substance? What are the real harms of that? And can we solve the real harms of that kind of usage? Can we get people medical care? Can we get people into treatment? Can we get people fed and housed in order to support their recovery? And why does it always have to be where people don't necessarily get access to treatment until they are arrested? And there are so many other problems, or so many other things that we've assigned in society as problems, that we don't give help for unless there is involvement in the criminal justice system. And I think it's really important that we start looking to minimize involvement in the criminal justice system, because there are always going to be harms. A criminal record is always, even a misdemeanor record, is always going to harm somebody's job prospects. It is always going to prevent somebody from getting a higher paying job, or at least limit their ability to find employment. And that's going to affect their housing, and that's going to affect their kids. And so the real harms are not necessarily drug usage. They're all the other harms that go along with involvement in the criminal justice system. And so when it comes to defunding the police, we need to look at what are the actual harms that we're trying to solve? What are the root causes? What are the actual harms to humans in our society? And what are the additional harms that are caused through the criminal justice system and policing? And how do we minimize those harms through redirecting funds? And that has to be the way to do it, because we have to look at the budgets. all across the board. And there's only a limited amount of funds, and we have to prioritize what we want police to actually do, and they can't possibly do everything that we have assigned them in our society, which is to solve all of the harms, all of the issues.
Thank you. Mike, do you want to follow up with your perspective on defunding? And
certainly, and I appreciate both Amanda and Jael's perspective, and just kind of want to follow up on what Sheriff Applehans and Lieutenant Lee said. When I think of the idea or the concept of defunding the police, it really is a needs-based type allocation, and law enforcement truly cannot be there to solve every problem, but oftentimes we are tasked with exactly that. Training across the board is not where it needs to be across the country. And I think there are some great programs out there already. The crisis intervention team program that we have here locally has been very good for our folks. You know, it trains de-escalation. It trains that jail is not the option all of the time. And programs like that. There's another one from Sheriff Applehand's neck of the woods down in Denver where they're sending social workers on low-level welfare check calls. The law enforcement is never involved unless they need to be, unless they're those extreme cases. Again, there's no easy answer. Oftentimes you hear how mental health is a key aspect of a lot of these cases that rise to the level of causing problems with law enforcement. And unfortunately, oftentimes there's a combination between mental health and substance that puts it in a position where mental health professionals are not able to truly effectively deal with it. So they're often very difficult situations that need to be dealt with from multiple facets, and law enforcement is only one piece of that equation. And I think sometimes that aspect gets lost.
thank you for that. And just to reiterate, you know, I don't want this to just be me funneling questions. You know, if you have a pushback or an agreement or something with what another panelist said, please feel free, obviously, like in a respectful manner, to jump in and push back against that. That's how this conversation is hard enough to start, right? But the dialogue within them is definitely the most difficult part, but I think the most important part. But I do want to go back, referring to something that Mike brought up in terms of increased training, because what I've noticed is a lot of these conversations about using buzzwords of police reform, police abolition, defunding the police, you know, there's always this question that goes back to training. And is the solution more training? Is the solution these, you know, what I would consider lower level reform changes that wouldn't necessarily change the entire layout of how one's agency works? And so I pose this question to anyone that wants to jump on it first, but what, either from your experience or from things that you've studied or things that you've seen in other departments, how efficient are those lower level reform measures? Thinking of increased training, I've heard things of like differentiating police officers' uniforms to come off as more friendly and maybe not so militarized, more community engagement with your communities and who you work with, and things of like diversifying your police force. You know, what are your perspective on how efficient those can be when looking at these core issues? And whoever would like to jump on that, if anyone has.
I guess I'll go first. I do think those kind of lower level ones are efficient, but it's just a small piece of trying to solve a larger problem. So they're not the end all be all, but they are important. If you know, engaging in your community, like I said, starts to build trust with your community and your interactions with them. We've kind of talked about this, you know, a little bit. Yes, we're peace officers, and yes, we deal in law enforcement, but we're in the people business, is basically what it is. We deal with people on all kinds of different levels. And so making sure that our force can better reflect the people that we serve, being able to engage our community and in a non-law enforcement type of way also helps, like I said, build community. And then training definitely helps out quite a bit. We're talking about some of these larger reforms that we want to make within the criminal justice system. And unfortunately, the reality is that not all of those reforms happen quickly. And so trying to train your officers to deal with every situation that they can come across. Because like I said, one of the core problems right now is that law enforcement gets called to everything. You know, it's just one little thing that we do to try and better serve our community. In a larger perspective, of course, we would want to delegate more of that stuff out to where you don't have to provide nearly as much training, and then you can, you know, focus on kind of the other things in terms of the community policing, being out with the community and making those relationships. And so, so kind of a long answer to answer your question is yes, they're effective, but it's just one tool, just a small piece of, you know, a larger perspective of trying to solve a larger problem.
And okay, I want to jump in here. And Sheriff, thank you for your answer. And I'm just going to push back a little bit, because I think that when we're talking about being effective, what are you talking about, right? Like, what are we actually trying to change, right? We rarely identify what the shift is you're looking for. And in my opinion, what needs to happen, or what I wanted to happen before, is a total cultural shift in law enforcement and policing. And that lack of knowledge is just a very small part of that, right? When we're talking about microaggressions, when we're talking about racism, that's just a small part of it, right? And knowledge is only powerful if you put it to action, right? We said, well, let's put body cameras on them, right? Nothing's going to happen now. And what do we see? Everything's caught on camera. So now it's a different story, right? And we said all these different reforms are supposed to change policing. And we said little by little, incremental by incremental, but we're still seeing the same things over and over and over again. So I struggle with this being quote unquote effective, because similar to what happens in corporate America, or even in education, where we throw a training on everything, we make people sit down for a certain set of hours. And then we say, well, now you're an expert. Right? We say, now you know everything, and now you go out into the world, and now I believe that you are more well-equipped than you were 36 hours before this training, when in reality, what you did for 36 hours was identify my privilege, and then now I get to go on into the world how I wanted before. It doesn't necessarily change the culture. The policies and the groups that are within policing allowed to uphold the white supremacy that has existed for years and years and years, right? These policies have to take a complete shift. Unions need to be decentralized. Unions have to have less power. When people talk about the fact that, you know, that government has these checks and balances, it actually doesn't exist, because we come down and we look at our police unions and we look at how much power they have, right? Just look at what's happening in Minneapolis. So when we're talking about these different trainings and these different efforts to be effective, I struggle, because on the surface level, maybe now I know more about microaggressions. Does that mean I identify with how I use them? Does that mean I recognize my own privilege? Does that mean I actually understand the institution of policing? So I understand what you're saying, Sheriff, but I also want to say, when we're talking about policing and the shift that needs to happen, in my opinion, it's a completely cultural thing that has existed for far too long, that has allowed these things to exist farther and more. And actually what we're just seeing now is that these things have existed for long farther. It's just that now we see them on camera. Now they're being captured. Now they're being recorded. And now we have irrefutable evidence. And even still then, we're still talking about these things as if they don't exist. Right? We're still talking about them, and I can give you evidence, and you can still tell me what I see didn't happen. So when that happens, I really struggle to question whether or not we're actually being effective in what we're doing.
Can I chime in a little bit with that?
Absolutely.
Training in itself is not the answer. Effective training is what it's going to take. And it doesn't start with veteran police officers. This starts at the police academy. If I bring in a person for de-escalation training and they don't believe what they're teaching the police officers, because that's often the problem, you know, it's lip service. It amounts to lip service. We've satisfied, you know, the idea that we had to have this training, but it really doesn't go to the heart of the problem, because the person or persons who are teaching this particular block of instruction don't believe it. They still have the old guard mentality. So it starts in the police academy. And then once you're out, we have to teach our troops. My troops, I tell them all the time, I expect you to hold each other accountable. You can't expect the public to trust you because you are the police. They trust you because of your actions. If they see a police officer doing something wrong and another police officer stands up and says, no, I have to stop him from doing that, that changes hearts and minds in the communities. So it's not training for the sake of training. It's effective training. And you have to go back and I'm of the mindset that it starts in the academies. It starts there. If you're going to teach about implicit bias, so people understand that, you have preconceived notions based upon race, based upon ethnicity. These things exist and you're cognizant of that. You may do things differently, but it has to be drummed in. And then there has to be accountability on the part of the police officers. You have to hold each other accountable. I can't expect you to trust me and do what I say or follow my instructions if I'm unwilling to follow the laws myself. So it's a tough situation. It's not something that's insurmountable. We have to actually care about getting it done.
Mr. Lee, I have a question for you then, because you mentioned effective training. I guess my question is, what benefit or what incentive do officers actually have to act in ethical ways? Because the justice system, we've seen time and time again, even if they're quote unquote held accountable, don't actually hold them accountable, right? So what incentive is held for this? I can't believe that every single individual in the law enforcement has this ethical person, I'm here to help the community. You would like to believe that. I'd like to sit here and say that's the case, but it's not the reality. So what actually is the incentive to the officer to do this if the justice system itself doesn't hold them accountable, right? Because if they do something wrong, it's like, well, it just gets swept under the rug and we kind of all figure it out and we go on with our lives.
Well, I can tell you this. As a police officer, I can make an arrest for a crime that's committed. And when I take that person before a judge, it's outside of it's out of my hands at that point in time what the judge does. So I can only deal with what goes on with the individual police officers. The entire system we know is in need of repair. It really needs to be deconstructed and built again because it wasn't built for people that look like me.
Right.
So at the end of the day, we have to control what we can control. We have to hold each other accountable. We have to make sure that those officers that are within the system that, as you said, aren't there to serve the people, aren't there for altruistic reasons, we drum them out of the police profession. Because you make my job more difficult if you go out there and you abuse the public, you abuse your authority. So once we clean up our own house, then we can start trying to worry about what goes on in the court systems and things of that nature. But we have to hold ourselves accountable first and foremost as the police.
Mike, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I did, and certainly appreciate the answers that were provided. And I would like to take Lieutenant Lee's point and maybe drum it back even a little bit further and correspond it with Jael's concerns. And that is that a lot of these law enforcement trainings that we see, the buzzwords that you referred to earlier are often strictly reactive, and that as a profession, law enforcement oftentimes is not thinking ahead and looking at the bigger picture. They look at their micro window and not truly serving everyone that should be served. And that includes visitors to your city. That includes not only everybody in your city, but every aspect of that population. And oftentimes that's missed. And I know in some of the research and the readings that I've done, especially in response to George Floyd and the defunding pieces, that some of that call that maybe for a standardization of that training, maybe beyond just our academies. You know, the academies in some states are only like 12 weeks. Well, we wouldn't let a doctor go do an operation with 12 weeks of training. And you wouldn't let some other, a lawyer in the court with 12 or 18 or 22 weeks of training. They're going to get several years. And while we try to increase that level of training, certainly a bachelor's degree is a great start. Some sort of higher level education to supplement what they get at the academy. But beyond that, the other point that you actually brought up earlier, and that's the recruiting point. Sheriff Applehands mentioned it earlier too, where if our forces don't represent the entire populations that we serve, how are they going to truly be able to make some of those bridges effective? And between the background portion and the education portion and the recruiting and retention pieces, we certainly struggle within that profession, at least here in our region. I would be curious to hear Lieutenant Lee's take on that particular issue, as it relates to his jurisdiction.
Well, I'll let you know that the laws in Illinois have just recently changed. They gave us a chance to clean up our own house, and now the legislature has imposed things that most law enforcement individuals believe have gone too far. Well, my take on it is, how much longer can they wait for us to fix what's going on with us? So they're implementing body cams for everybody across the state. They're looking at, immunity with regard to police officers and whether that should be something that takes place. So either we're going to fix it or somebody's going to fix it for us.
Thank you. Thank you for all of those answers. And before we get into some of the questions we're getting in the chat, I just want to follow up with one in regards to training, because I think, I see both sides of the argument in terms of efficiency of training. And I think what's more threatening to communities is the idea that there's a pervasive culture within law enforcement agencies of like the good old boys club, and that idea that you can take any amount of training or any type of training, but ultimately it's the culture within your agency that influences people's daily decisions. And so I'm curious, if the solution is improving training, getting more access to training, ensuring that those who are giving the training are efficient at their job, what then do we do about this culture that we know exists? And maybe if you don't want to admit that that culture exists, what do you do about the bad apples that at least give agencies the perception that there is that dangerous and toxic culture existing within agencies?
Well, law enforcement, we can't afford to have bad apples. That's just the way I look at it. We have the power of life and death as police officers, more power than any judge, any prosecutor. We can be judge, jury, and executioner right there on the street. So we can't afford to have bad apples. That's what I spoke about earlier, where you have to hold each other accountable. And there has to be a mechanism in place when an officer is charged or a police chief wants to remove an officer from the profession, that they can do that. Oftentimes, a police chief can go through all the process, fire a police officer. There are unions that come back, they fight it, and the officers get back into the department. So the system itself breeds that idea that there's a good old boys network, and it's very, very difficult unless there's some union reform and some of the other things that are going to be necessary to root out the causes of abuse in our communities. That's just a fact.
And I don't know if Aaron, Mike, or Amanda would want to speak on their perspective on that question in a state with no police union, and maybe explore the other protective guises that law enforcement agencies in Wyoming can utilize or don't utilize. Mike, did you have something?
I do, and you hit on the point, as we are not a union state here in Wyoming, and we do have the ability to decertify in the event that we do have an issue. In fact, one of then Sergeant Applehand's last acts of he and I working together was an issue that we found that we did not have with a trainee, and he ended up no longer as a peace officer. And so the system is there. But again, if there's not reporting mechanisms, if there's not an ability for the entire population to know where to go, if they have an issue, if they have a concern, if they have a complaint, then that's a concern, not only within law enforcement. We had our town hall last night, and there was concerns raised about reporting mechanisms, and we did not have, obviously, enough pieces in place to let folks know where to go to file a complaint in the event there is a complaint. I know some states require signed affidavits to make a complaint against a police officer. And certainly there's protections there, and I would imagine that that's probably largely driven by the union. However, here, at least in our agency, you can text a complaint completely anonymously, and we're going to investigate it and do our due diligence.
That's one of the reforms in Illinois. We had to have an affidavit. Our governor just signed a bill. Well, now you can complaints can be lodged anonymously. So there are things, and I have mixed feelings about that, because this is a tough job. You know, so I don't want to minimize what police officers do. Not everybody wants to do this. You're not going to be compensated. How can someone quantify how much I should be paid to put my life on the line for somebody else? So this is a noble profession. Does not mean everybody within it is noble. So rooting out the bad apples should be our number one charge as police officers. That builds that trust in the communities. It starts with us. It starts with us.
I can comment a little bit on protections in lieu of police unions here in the state, because we do not have police unions here, because our state is extremely anti-union of all kinds, unfortunately, for the other kinds of unions. But there are a lot of protections in state statutes, in addition to things like qualified immunity. But there are hiring and firing protections that apply specifically to police officers, that don't necessarily apply to other public employees, as far as I know. There are also sort of interesting mechanisms within county government that can also be kind of used to kind of circle the wagons that we've sort of seen. We may not be able to get too much into that, but it does seem that most of the complaints processes tend to be internal to specific agencies, or there isn't a well-known or well-publicized public complaints process. So even when ACOP has been kind of doing this work, we would get questions like, what is the complaints process? What is that like? And it tends to be, well, it goes, you know, through the chain of command, or it goes to the chief of police, or the head of whatever agency, and it isn't clear. And it's very much the police policing the police, which is not necessarily very conducive to public trust, and it's not necessarily conducive to actually knowing that there will be consequences. And it's not conducive to consistency either. So it varies widely across agency, and it varies widely depending on who's heading that agency. So that's one thing that we've seen. I also think that, like, in regards to the discussion about training, training can only do so much if you have, you know, if you've been in law enforcement and you have decades of training that's contradictory to that training, and a culture that's contradictory to the new training. Even in my experience when I did coroner basic, there are things that we were taught that have since been thrown out of courts. Things that are not particularly scientific, and that's within the last 10 years or so. So it's, and hopefully those are updated, but it's hard to unlearn things. And so overall, what we're trying to talk about with the defund the police conversation is look at who's being harmed, look at which residents are being harmed the most. And here, lately anyway, it's been people who suffer from mental illnesses. And we need to look at redirecting how we can reduce police contact, because that's the most guaranteed way to prevent somebody from getting killed. Honestly, like, if we're really honest about it, that's the most assured way to prevent someone from being killed, is to make sure that they have resources available ahead of time and before things escalate, and also make sure that the person responding is not armed, and preferably without police or without arrest powers. And hopefully those people do not end up in jail, but we also need to look at the resources that are available for people to go to, the hospital resources specifically. So sorry if that was long and rambling, but thank you.
Really quick, I'll touch on this so we can move on. But I think when we talk about bad apples, I struggle with that because it implies that the whole tree was rooted in great soil and everything else has borne fruit, and we only have a couple that fell, right? It implies that the system itself was not actually designed the way it was designed, and the American policing system is inherently racist. So therefore, the bad apples argument to me is extremely canceled, because you can't sit here and tell me it's one bad apple that fell and one little mistake that we had here and everybody else is good. Right? And that bad apple argument is further then enforced by our justice system, right? Because the bad apples get away with what they do. So then therefore you can't sit here and tell me there is no toxic culture, because they have been told time and time again, they're an exception to the law. You're an exception to everything that's in place. Our justice system, our politicians have constantly supported the American policing system out of favor of our Black and brown people, right? And when you look at it, we're talking about this country promising us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And we're still asking for life. That's something Angela Rye has talked about many times. We're still at the point where we're asking for people to put a value on our lives. And so we come back to this argument about bad apples or what's going on when the tree itself, right, was rooted in bad soil. So when we're talking about the policing system and we're talking about the culture, sometimes it feels a bit redundant and circular to me because nobody wants to talk about its beginnings. And whether or not you believe it has changed over that time, the policies haven't. The people who are enforcing the policies haven't. The actions of our justice system haven't. So therefore, these things get to reiterate themselves and build on themselves, and people can then continue living the way that they want to live. Now, ideally, in a great system, in a great world where everybody acted ethically and morally, everything would change. Right? We wouldn't even need to have this conversation because people would realize that the value on somebody's life should not be in the hand of one man, right? We would realize like things that happened with Breonna Taylor, where you can walk into somebody's house and we're still not talking about that. And to this day, we still don't have a verdict that we should have. The fact that in March, we're going to be talking about George Floyd, but people still have quote unquote mixed feelings about what happened. When you have these type of situations, you cannot tell me that the culture that exists is not toxic, it is not racist, and it is not rooted in white supremacy.
Can I just push back a little bit? What happened, you talked about Breonna Taylor. The police department did their part. They arrested the officer. The system failed us. George Floyd, the same situation. The officers were arrested. The system failed us. So it's not necessarily that, and I understand bad apples. You and I are on the same page with this. This entire law enforcement structure, you know, its inception was terrible. You know, so at the end of the day, you're not going to get anything or very many things good out of it. You know, so but how do we change that is the $1 million question. You know, you have to have police because absent the police might makes you right. So you absent you don't want a police state, but you need law enforcement. So I guess the only thing I can say with regard to this is that, like I said, the police have to hold themselves accountable. We have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to hold the people that work with us accountable. But once we've held them accountable and it's outside of our hands, removing them from the system, from law enforcement, oftentimes that's taken away from us. We don't have that final determination with regard to it, at least here in Illinois. And I can only speak about that. I've never policed anywhere other than that. You know, so what I'm saying is that the police are getting, you know, a lot of the attention, but the system itself is broken. The system itself is broken. And even if you want to do the right thing, it's difficult to get to the finish line with regard to it. Now, so how do we go about fixing that?
Well, Mr. Lee, I have a question, and specifically with Breonna Taylor's situation. From my understanding, evidence proved that they weren't even supposed to be at her house, right? Like evidence proved that they
Absolutely.
They'd gone to the wrong house. So when we're talking about, I understand what you're saying of the system, and right, those existed. Some to me, they're interlinked and in tandem, right? It's very hard to separate our law and justice system to some extent, but when we're talking about what happened to Beyonce, they shouldn't even have been at her house. So to what extent do I put, when we shift responsibility, I struggle, because if you as an officer, it is your job to know where you're going. If you're going to go in and do this raid, if you're going in armed, if you go in with this intention, you should be at the right house. And when
I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Right. So when we see this happen, I agree. Maybe after the fact, now it's the justice system's fault. But prior to, they shouldn't even been at her house. So
I understand that, but are you unfairly holding the police officers? Because the police officers that exercise warrants aren't the people that go in and get the warrants typically. They're just doing the job because they've trusted the information that's come down the pipeline. So I just want, and that's where civilians and police officers get, things kind of, we can understand as police officers what went wrong. Whereas the society in total can't really understand it. They don't know how the process goes. Oftentimes, the people that are executing those warrants are going on what they believe is good information. So they get caught up in the wash, where what should happen is the person that went and got that warrant should be in trouble. The person that fired that weapon should not have fired that weapon. That person should be in trouble. They should be locked up. There has to be accountability with regard to that. That's what I'm talking about, holding police accountable. But once we've done that, there has to be some follow-up. There has to be some support for the decisions that are made by the police to remove those quote-unquote bad apples from the system. And we understand the system is broken, but it's broken all the way through.
Sure. And I understand that, and you're right. Like, as I'm not going to understand the systems and ways in which warrants are awarded and who goes where and who's told to go do what. What I do understand, though, is that Breonna Taylor ended up dead, right? And to me, the
absolutely, and somebody was a police officer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. And someone should be held accountable for that. Just because you made a mistake does not mean you should not be held accountable for that mistake. Someone lost their life. Bottom line. And unfortunately, I think police officers, when they make mistakes, don't feel like there should be punishment that goes along with it. No, yeah, there's punishment for everybody else. Why shouldn't there be punishment for us?
And I think that goes into our first guest question perfectly. This is from Erica, and she wants to hear everyone's perspective on ending qualified immunity. And I would be interested in, if you don't stand on the side of ending qualified immunity, what benefit do you think it brings to communities? And Aaron, if you'd like to start that off and share your perspectives on that.
Qualified immunity is really just, it's difficult. That's kind of a really difficult issue to deal with, because on one hand, we want to do everything we can to hold police officers accountable, have those processes in there to where if an officer does something wrong, you can get them out, they can be found liable, and that there's consequences within that justice system. And so for qualified immunity, it's difficult the way it's constructed right now, because basically it makes it so difficult to hold an officer accountable without proving that whatever mistake, whatever the outcome was of that, of their incident that they're involved in, that they didn't do it like on purpose, that they didn't do it maliciously. And so for qualified immunity, I definitely think it needs to be reframed. So make it to where it's easier, to where we can hold officers accountable on multiple different levels, not only criminally, but liability, but still have a protection in place for, if you're helping somebody out and for reasons out of your control, something goes wrong, then that officer isn't held liable. So one of the things that we see here that's kind of a good example of what I'm explaining in Wyoming is like good faith laws, good Samaritan laws, where, and this is more for the general public, if general public sees something that's that's happening, and then they go and they try and help somebody, you know, and it doesn't necessarily go right, you know, they're covered, they don't lose everything. So well, one of the best examples I can give is like if you know, somebody's not breathing and then you go and you perform CPR, and you're doing chest compressions, and then you end up breaking a couple of ribs, but you end up saving that person, you know, do you want to be held liable for not, you know, for breaking those ribs, you know, or do we want to have a system in place where people start to think about that before that they give help? So like I said, qualified immunity, I think is pretty difficult because the way it's constructed right now really limits, you know, limits the consequences on police officers. And I think it needs to be changed to where, like I said, more police officers can be held accountable for the actions that, you know, that they perform on duty.
And just another comment in the chat, you know, when you vaguely talk about reforming qualified immunity and how it plays in with law enforcement, Angelique offers, you know, would one of those solutions be to get rid of qualified immunity and extend the Good Samaritan protections to officers? Absolutely. Would that be effective? Kevin, do you want to speak on that?
I completely agree. Abolish qualified immunity, because I have a different take on it. I think it protects the municipality as well as that police officer. So they have a vested interest in making sure that the deep pockets don't get hit, because the police officers, it has limited resources. The agency they work for has a greater purse that you can draw from. So qualified immunity not only benefits that police officer, but also benefits the agency. No, abolish qualified immunity. I have no problem with that, but understand, you're going to have to understand also that police officers, we take on a lot of risk in what we do. And as long as we're not reckless in the way we're performing our jobs, there should be some leeway given to us, and extending the Good Samaritan law would be absolutely fine with me. And the protections that they, you know, that includes.
So to go on with our questions from our attendees, can someone, and maybe one of our law enforcement officers, can you explain or offer an explanation for how police contact with Black men disproportionately end in violence and death?
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but if you take a look at society, that's why the contacts end up in death. How are Black men portrayed? You know, there is a fear of Black men, and ultimately that's throughout, you know, whatever profession you're gonna get involved in. That's an implicit bias that most people have, and unfortunately, police officers have dominance in most of those interactions, so they go sideways pretty quickly if you're unaware of who you are and what you're supposed to be doing there. So I think that's not.
Sorry, to add on to what Lieutenant Lee said, in a lot of areas, you're having more contact with African American males, and that's an issue as well, to where, you know, now all of a sudden, you know, like I said, that's that hard conversation where we have a lot of police departments that are going out and making those contacts with those individuals, and that's why you're seeing such a higher rate of use of force and violence. And like I said, in terms of broad policing, you know, we really got to, you know, kind of get away from that.
Right, and I think especially in the context of Wyoming, I think Black could be supplemented with Indigenous, especially when considering the over-policing that we witness in and around reservations. And so in hearing everyone agree that that's a thing and that's something, whatever kind of bias it is that exists, how do those trainings that as a community we're supposed to bank on. How do those trainings play into diminishing this fact?
Kimberly, if I may.
Yeah, please.
So there's a lot of options that, again, I think are not necessarily consistent across this country in law enforcement. Even when those situations rise to the level of use of deadly force, that should still be the last option. And sometimes things happen in a rapidly evolving, tense situation where you're not able to use other options. But if those other options, like electronic restraint, like beanbag rounds, like the new BOLA rounds, like all the other less lethal options are not on the table and are not accessible to those agencies, then ultimately we see more deaths. And it's not just with Black and brown people, it's with all people. And unfortunately, those less lethal options are not always seen as a priority for some agencies. Within the profession, we should always hold human life as absolutely our highest priority. And I think whether it's funding, whether it's a lack of leadership, whatever that may be, if they're not looking at all options and having them available for their staff, including the training that goes with it, then ultimately we're going to see that continue.
Anybody else want to tackle that idea?
I'll just touch on this real fast. I think that Black men or Black people, right, when you look at how even after slavery, right, we're viewed as 3/5 a person, right? You're a threat to society, right? People struggle with not even necessarily just your being, but the economic advancement of the Black man or of the Black people, right? So in any way you can suppress that, in any way you can carry on the disparities that exist that allow society to exist in its status quo, you're going to do that. It's not a happenstance that Black men are disproportionately, that their interactions with police end up in death. That's not just a causality that happens, right? This is happening very intentionally. When police are interacting, they are skipping every other opportunity they can have to ask questions or engage, and we're immediately going to threat, right? Immediately going to, I feel threatened. Doesn't matter if their hands are up. Doesn't matter if they voice exactly what they're doing. Right? We're going through these motions of not even remembering that we're teaching our young children who are 3-4 years old police etiquette. Why doesn't that scare people? Why doesn't that cause people to think maybe we have something wrong here? Right? That a 3-4-year-old knows how to act in the presence of the police because they're so terrified of what could happen. And those things do happen even at their young age. So I think it's to talk about that this society is threatened by the Black man. And I feel like we wait and we talk about and we grapple with, like, maybe people just don't know, or maybe people feel this way. And no, it's a threat, right? That advancement, the economic advancement, by 2050, 50% of America is supposed to be minorities. That is threatening to people. People do not like that. That is not a yay for people, right? Why do we see the things that we see in immigration? That's a Black issue as well. Why do we see the suppression we see there? People are threatened by the Black person in our society. So what ends up happening is our police then say they're threatened and they're protected. And then society says they're threatened and they can call the police on Black men over and over and again, and the police protect the individual. It doesn't matter what they were doing. So at the end of the day, I think it's just a matter of that society as a whole is threatened by the Black person and the Black man, and we've accepted it. And we've said that's what we want it to be.
All right, any more comments on that point or responses to anyone? This next question is going in a little bit of a different direction, still super relevant to this conversation. Spencer asked, and this is sort of a long one, if you all have the Q&A box, if you want to read along to keep up, you're more than welcome. But Spencer asked, earlier in the conversation, it seemed that most everyone agreed that the police are generally asked to handle problems that they shouldn't, and that we should perhaps redirect funds from law enforcement budgets to social work budgets. However, as this conversation has progressed, the law enforcement officers in the panel have fallen back to the talking point of needing more expensive training. My question to the law enforcement officers on the panel is this: do you agree with the idea that law enforcement budgets should be significantly reduced, that that staff should be cut so that social work and other services can be funded?
I guess my question is, why do they have to be mutually exclusive? It's not a one-pronged approach to this problem. You can say that you can take monies out of the police budget to help hire social workers or take care of that aspect of things, but still say that police officers need to be trained. You can't forfeit the training because you're putting monies into other pots. It's going to have to be a multi-pronged approach. That's just my thoughts on it.
And I think the perspective, or at least the idea of taking money from institution and putting it into another, is because if putting money into this other institution is to lessen the responsibility of law enforcement agencies, then it's simply not a need for the community to be spending money on in terms of maintaining it at the capacity that it exists before you get social workers involved. And so I think that's the question of, and this is something that we can also discuss, is getting social workers or any other type of workers involved in mental health responses or wellness checks, does that lessen the responsibility of police agencies and thus indicate that there is a need, less of a need for as large of an agencies that are operating? So feel free.
I don't know that we have any working models that will prove that yet. I know that Illinois has just moved to exactly that thought process. So we'll know down the line if that's something that worked. But I don't know. I wish I had the answer to that. You know, truthfully, it'd be great if we could have social workers and mentally ill, and they could deal with that situation. You still have to factor in, if it's not a police officer that's close, that mental health professional is going into a dangerous situation themselves. So this is going to take some time to flesh out to find out, you know, what is the proper balance between law enforcement and social work in dealing with the issues that we have in our society.
Mike, did you want to jump on that?
I did, and it's really, you know, those resources are finite. And in a rural community like Sheriff and I find ourselves serving, oftentimes we don't have enough social workers, we don't have enough mental health practitioners. Certainly we don't have them available at night when a lot of those types of issues arise. And that's where it ends up falling into law enforcement's plate. Is it an even, you know, plus minus type situation? Probably not. Those other resources need augmented as well. Problems in our society, especially around mental health, we have tracked, at least here locally, have exponentially grown over the last 5 to 7 years. We are seeing more and more of that all the time, and more serious cases. And what the causation for that is, we don't know. But it certainly tasks law enforcement, it raises the bar for us. And it also requires more of all of our other folks that we collaborate with here within this community. So that's a challenge, and it's again not necessarily a +2 -2 type situation where you take resources from one pot and put it into the other expecting it to solve the problem. It really needs a across the board collaboration and an increase in all of those services.
Definitely an area that I've been struggling with as a new administrator, working in a rural town with limited resources. Because like I said, on the surface, definitely I would love to take a lot of what I have and put it in other areas so that, you know, like I said, we can have better response, so I can, you know, take some off of the plate of either my patrol deputies or, you know, really divert people away from my detention center. And so it's really tough, because there's in some areas, like in terms of maybe trying to start a program like they have, like the STAR program that they have down in Denver, I need funds to, you know, to get that started so that I can take away some of the responsibilities in my agency. You know, I have some funds in my agency that I can take away and divert to other resources as well. And so, like I said, I agree that they're not mutually exclusive. It's not a, you know, take from here and put from here and then everything will be okay. I do think it has to be specific towards the community and and what they need. So at the larger departments that are expending tons and tons and tons of funds, definitely I think has that leeway to where, yeah, maybe we can take a lot more off of your budget, off of your plate, and divert it to other resources that we don't have. Smaller agencies, it gets to be difficult. So and it really should be more needs based. What are those needs of the community?
I think you're muted, Amanda. Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to push back just kind of gently on that a little bit. Maybe not so gently. I think that we need to recognize overall that what this conversation really is about is recognizing that there are harms to communities by law enforcement. Like, as much as we want to do, or as much as the goal is to do good, there are harms, there are consequences to any law enforcement contact. There are risks, there are disproportionate risks, as we know, to the Black community, to the Native community, to the community of folks with mental illnesses. And the more that we can reduce the size and scope of that contact with the law enforcement, the less risk there is going to be. We were looking at the budget for LPD recently, and the vast majority, I think it was 60% of the calls, or the service that they went on was, let me pull that up again, was officer generated. And yeah, events per day, 60% was officer generated. So what does that indicate? It's not calls coming in, it's not calls for help, it's things that officers are doing, that officers are initiating. So what that tells me is it's likely from patrol. And there have to be areas where there can be reduced contact, with communities that are already over-policed. We're in a rural area where you can't not drive. So, and we know just from comments and from what we're told with ACOP is that people are pulled over for very, very minor things that are wrong with their vehicles, very minor traffic issues, and every single one of those contacts is a risk because you're sending an armed person. And we need to really reduce the size and scope of these offices. And so is there less patrol that could happen? Is there prioritization of investigations instead of patrol? Can cops be pulled out of schools? Can we reduce all of our mental health contact? And somebody mentioned in the chat also, not just with social workers, but I think other programs use volunteers, peer support, people who have been in those situations before. And we can really use those kind of programs to reduce police contact. But we also had to have sufficient funding to provide services so that we can have preventative care as well, and a place for people to go that isn't the jail. And so I think it is important that we look at police budgets and reduce the size and scope, because there are direct harms, whether we like it or not. And that also leads into some decriminalization. Like, I realize that it's not just police that need to reduce their own size and scope. It's also state statutes that need to be looked into to reduce the drug laws, the number of drug laws on the books, the number of other minor offenses that could potentially lead to police contact, and that could also reduce the burden of what police officers have to be doing and have to be looking for all the time.
Thank you for that. And I do want to be conscious of everyone's time tonight. And there are a ton of questions from our viewers. Is everyone on the panel comfortable and okay with going until 7:30, just so we can get a few more of these questions and get closing remarks done? Does that work? Okay, so moving on, like I said, just going through some of the questions that we have in the chat. This is sort of generic, and whoever feels comfortable can jump on it first. This is from Blake Harris. What do you think is the genuine purpose of incarceration? And how can communities begin to decarcerate people? And Aaron, if you want to jump on that.
So two things. I think the purpose of incarceration should be rehabilitation. It's not right now. It's punishment, is what it is. And that punishment, like we said, it comes down all through society. You know, once you have a police record, once you're incarcerated, especially at that felony level, it makes it extremely difficult to go through society successfully. You essentially hit a ceiling. There's only so many jobs that you can get. There's only so many areas that you can access when you have that. And so, like I said, to answer that question, you know, what's the genuine purpose of it? I said it should be rehabilitation, to where, you know, you pay your debt to society and you can go back and be reintegrated into society. But right now, based on our system, that's definitely not what's happening.
Mike, I saw you smiling. Do you want to add on?
I can only imagine what Dr. Dixon could inform us and enlighten us on this particular topic, and the monetization that's tied to some of the criminal penalties. If you want to look at racist statute, look at the difference between crack cocaine and regular cocaine back in the 80s, and the war on drugs and all those pieces. That it essentially has turned into, for some places at least, a huge business at the expense of human beings. And certainly there are those evil people, murderers, others that deserve to be removed from society. And those are a limited few. Is it a panacea to say we should be rehabilitating some of these folks? Maybe a stretch for some, but certainly for others, it's an absolute possibility that we should be trying to get through. There's a huge tax burden to our society. You talk about a pool of resources available to help solve problems. There you go.
Anyone else want to jump on what they think the genuine purpose of incarceration is, or how ways communities can possibly start to decarcerate members of their community? Jael?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on one. People need to look at what people are getting incarcerated for. I think people need to take a better look at why people are getting incarcerated and why disproportionate to our population, our Black men and women are in the system, and specifically incarcerated. But I also want to talk about recidivism, because I think we talk about people getting incarcerated, but then we also don't talk about recidivism and the rates at which we see that. And then I don't really know if voluntary recidivism is a word or coined term, but then we talk about people going back into the system voluntarily, because that's where they can get 3 meals a day, that's where they can be housed, and that's where they have a warm bed to lay. When you look at that, Our society's priorities are backwards. The fact that I can find that within the prison system, within the jail, but I can't find that out here volunteered by our politicians or society that's meant to see us grow is an issue, right? And then we talk about things like, okay, well, they come out and we have new laws like ban the box, right? Where you don't have to actually check the box, but some employers can employ it. Oh, not all states are on the same vein. Some people can ask, some people can't ask. They can ask. It doesn't create a society that's conducive for these members to come back and reintegrate, right? So why wouldn't they go back? Because society has continuously rejected them. So I think we can talk about why people are getting incarcerated for very minor charges. We can talk about why people are so afraid of the police and don't want any interaction at all, because these can result in very little things coming about and seeing you in the system. And even once you get out of the system, even once you've been released, even once whatever the minor charge was, like we have all said, that remains a stain that you can never write. They wear this A on their chest that they have to carry with them the rest of their lives. And so some people do see recidivism as the better option. And that fact is often ignored, and people often don't want to talk about it because they think that the only people that are in jails are the worst people, right? We skip very far to the extremes, and it's 100% monetary. It's 100% monetary, especially our private prisons, right? Let's talk about how many private prisons are in America right now. Let's talk about the school to prison pipeline. That's not just there for funsies, right? It creates a monetary stream, and that continues to influx our economy. And it's just another feature of capitalism that exists.
Thank you for that. And I'm in taking Jael's comments and Aaron, your own comments, being in this position of power that you found yourself in sheriff of the Albany County Sheriff's Office, you know, what ways, and I see some comments, you know, of people pushing back about hearing about tax burdens and budgets. And although that's very real, there are people in power that can influence things such as budgets and resources to other things. So I'm wondering, in thinking about influencing incarceration rates, what do you think with your position of power you have influence of in terms of that?
Really just trying to influence at a local level of how my detention center should be used and who should be coming through that detention center. We've talked a lot about all these kind of other facets. And I've talked a lot that the detention center is a detention center. And I use the detention center because that's almost kind of like that single point of entry into that criminal justice system. Like I said, the detention center it is not a hospital. You know, it's not a homeless shelter. It shouldn't be a drunk tank. You know, it should be to, like I said, detain those that need to be detained. And so as a whole system, we really need to take a look at all of those processes in terms of, you know, what's the crime and you know, what's the best response. You know, like I guess we talked about mental health. Jail and prison is not the best place. If anything, that's the worst place for people that are suffering from you know, those ailments. People with substance abuse problems, again, a detention center, getting into the criminal justice system, you know, jail is not a great place for them as well. You know, treatment facilities or treatment options are a better way to go. So, and then just looking at, you know, crimes, especially misdemeanor crimes, doesn't warrant an arrest. You know, should it be a fine? Should it be a citation? Should it be some other option with that? And then piggybacking on all of those, then what is the fine? You know, do we, you know, you've heard all the talk about ending cash bail, those other monetary systems that disproportionately, you know, affect, you know, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and basically creates recidivists because, you know, they can't pay their fines, and then they get warrants, and then they get arrested, and then they, you know, it perpetually keeps them within the criminal justice system. So a lot of it that I'm looking at is what can we do better to really just divert people away from the criminal justice system.
Thank you for that. Sorry, just going through all of these. Okay, so this one is from Claire, and she's wondering, how can agencies improve data collection and reporting, such as use of force, to better understand characteristics of incidents? Currently don't have the data to truly understand the extent and nature of the problem. And I would add on to that, specifically for those working in Wyoming, because what we've run into in terms of anyone outside of law enforcement trying to access misconduct reports or anything, there's state statute that blocks that. And so I'm curious, one, in reiterating Claire's question of how can agencies improve data collection, and then is there any benefit that you can see within the community to either push against state statute or find a way around it so that these reports can be accessible to the community? Mike, would you like to jump on that? And then we can go to Illinois and Minneapolis.
Certainly. So some of that data is already collected by the academy, but it's not tracked to the individual officer. Certainly agencies, if they're doing their due diligence, by all means, will be tracking that and reviewing that periodically to make sure that it's proportionate. Every situation should be reviewed by a first-line supervisor. And certainly those that reach any sort of concern threshold should be reviewed by a larger entity. Certainly law enforcement agencies are going to be held accountable going forward. Transparency is another one of those buzzwords that law enforcement agencies, if they want to be truly respected, truly trusted by their communities, are going to have to be willing to share that information. That's the way I see it anyway. Certainly Sheriff and Lieutenant Lee may see it differently, but from my perspective, I think that's going to be an expectation going forward.
Well, to piggyback on that, that is the expectation here in Illinois. The laws have changed. Reporting, collecting, disseminating that information. We don't have a choice, but that's going to have to be done at the legislative level. It should be taken out of the hands of law enforcement, and the legislature should say, hey, look, this is what we need to have done. And then everyone falls in line after.
Aaron, anything to add on? And I guess my question, hearing from Chief Samp, it sounds like it's going to be the assumed expectation of the communities. Is that something that you two see personally implementing within the near future in ways, of course, that are in accordance with state statute?
Yes, it is. Like I said, I think it's coming, and I also think it's the right thing to do. Is to, like I said, to collect that data. Like I said, we work for the public, and the public has a right to know. And so collecting all of the data and then being able to disseminate it. The second thing is also trying to really try and collect data that you can gather information in. So instead of just having kind of your general data, like how many traffic stops did we did, how many contacts did we have, really trying to break it down by every single category so that you can, really glean the information, on what that law enforcement office is doing. So, and I also agree with Lieutenant Lee as well. So there definitely needs to be some push at the legislative level to make sure that law enforcement can have that requirement to report.
And I would only add that we have already started. We included some of that demographic information in our annual security report for last year. So we are already producing some of that information. Certainly that process will grow and expand going forward. But we were able to share it, get it in last minute into the security report, largely because of the delays caused by COVID last fall with some of our federal reporting guidelines.
This next question is from Sean. When you're talking about accountability, and I think this is firstly to the officers, and then I do want to hear from Jael and Amanda. When you're talking about accountability, would you say that law enforcement may be suffering from too much of a police cultural identity to the point that they make the decision to confront other police officers on personal levels without any administrative consequences? And with this, would there be less worry from officers of the legal consequences to their decision making, and escalation of behaviors is more pervasive? I'm going to break this one up. I think the main gist of this question, talking about accountability, would you say law enforcement may be suffering from too much of a police culture identity that influences officers' decisions when making personal decisions to confront other officers without any administrative consequences? Anyone want to jump? It's a lot of words.
I can take a first stab if somebody wants to back me up on this. Definitely a bit convoluted, but I think back to some of the changes that were implemented under President Obama and the push to demilitarize police. When I hear that question, certainly from an image perspective, I think at least regionally, a lot of agencies took that to heart. That maybe a refocus was in order, and making sure that not only from an external perspective but an internal perspective that we're not the military. We're here to serve the public. There's maybe an occasional need for some of that equipment and that mentality, but by and large, that is a small percentage of what law enforcement does generally, at least in our region. And certainly it may vary, likely vary across the country. But as far as the internal, workings of different departments, I think you alluded to that earlier about the good old boy network, and how that plays into some of those decisions made by officers in the street. I think the point that Lieutenant Lee made earlier about expecting his folks to intervene when they see something wrong, whether it's his folks or anyone, that is the point that should not have taken so long to get to by getting to George Floyd. That's the one of the main takeaways law enforcement is getting with this George Floyd situation, is that the need for policy of duty to intervene, and really that should have been a human nature thing versus having to have it written in policy.
Cool. And I think just because that one was sort of wordy, we'll move on to the next one. Thank you, Chief Samp, for tackling that. And I think you provided a great answer. Next question is from Matthew, and I think this is probably more directed towards Mike or Aaron. Is the UYO Report It website helpful at all in reporting incidents of all types, including PD misbehavior?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, the UWYO Report It website, I think it's mainly marketed as reporting sexual assaults that happen on campus or that happen to students. Matthew's asking, is that a helpful resource to use when reporting incidences of police misconduct?
So I can take that one. By all means, it's acceptable. That actually goes to our Title IX office, who does not only sexual harassment and assault investigations, but any sort of discriminatory action at the university. So certainly we work with that office, and if they were to use that Report It website, by all means it would get to us so the issue could be addressed. That said, I do have concerns that information about that website is not as broadly known as it probably needs to be. That was pretty apparent in some of the conversation at the at the town hall last night, and I apologize for those of you that weren't there and didn't see that piece, but we had some indication that there was some folks with some, very realistic concerns that did not know the proper reporting channels. So I think we all have some more work to do in that area.
Thank you. And this question is from Toby. And we still have about 15 minutes left. I'm thinking we go on for about 7 more minutes of questions, and then we'll do closing remarks for everyone. Toby wonders, could the heavy militarization and frequent overuse of force by the police also be seen as the manifestation of might makes right? And I think he's referencing Kevin Lee's comment about if we got rid of the police, we might live in a society where might makes right. So he's just wondering if that's the case where militarized police sense, or what the community feels as a militarized police sense, is already enacting that. Was that also convoluted? Aaron, do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I'll try and tackle it. That's a long question. I do think that, like I said, providing some of that militarization as they classify it as those tools. I think he's trying to make that connection that because you have that equipment, that you feel that you need to use it. And I agree with that sentiment a little bit. I mean, definitely there's departments out there that were like, hey, if I had this equipment available, why wouldn't I grab it, and why wouldn't I, take the opportunity to use it? And so, do I think it contributes to, increased use of force with some of that equipment? Yeah, it does. I mean, it really does. That's just, that's the hard truth of it. If you live in a super small town and you went and got yourself an armored tank, that's the message that you're sending, is that you're going to use that. So yeah, on a level, yes, I do think that it creates more of a use of force. So I think that's kind of a general answer to that long question.
Okay, so I'm thinking 2 more questions that are much easier to understand. And I want to start with Amanda for this one. This is from Erica again. Do panelists agree that we criminalize poverty in America?
I would definitely agree that we criminalize poverty in numerous ways, from fines and fees to infractions for having something wrong with your vehicle, to court fees, to criminalizing people who struggle with mental illnesses when when care for mental health is not available and not provided, and not free in this country. And then, just like we had talked about before, involvement in the criminal justice system can cause further spirals down into poverty. So, yeah, definitely.
Kevin, what's your perspective on criminalizing poverty?
The short answer is yes. Unfortunately, the interactions, you're going to have the public calling on people that are homeless, mental health individuals that have mental health issues typically don't act the way, quote unquote, normal people act in public. So you have a heightened sense of concern, and people start calling the police. The interactions happen, so yeah, it's a bad situation. I completely agree with it.
Overwhelming consensus, I'm assuming. Cool. So I think we'll end the question part from the public with this Tessa's question. Jael mentioned earlier that policing began as a system to catch slaves. To the law enforcement officers, do officers within your agencies know this history? And do you think it's important for police to be educated about this history? Mike, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So when I went through college back in the 80s, not to totally date myself, but that piece was not included in the initial training of the history of policing and how it started in Europe with the bobbies and that, which technically didn't predate some of the issues in our own American South. So by all means, in order for law enforcement to be truly educated, they do need to not only hear about the history, but understand it and how that history impacts how we do our job today, and be open to evolving past where that history started.
Kevin, what would you say?
I think the history of law enforcement is no different than American history. We don't know it. We haven't been taught it. You know, it's been watered down at best, you know, and the only way you're going to get to understand something is to know about it. Chief, you're absolutely right. If you're not taught about it, you don't have an understanding of it, you can't then go out there and have empathy for people that you're dealing with, you know? So that's an overarching American societal problem. We don't have any sense of history, and especially Black history. So.
Yeah, Aaron, do you want to go?
I said I echo the same. I didn't go to academy as far back as Chief Samp did, but I had similar experience where that wasn't taught, and it was one of those things I had to learn on my own. And same with what Lieutenant Lee said too. In terms of broader history, there's a lot of those things that you don't get taught in school, no matter how far you went through school. And so it is important for law enforcement to know, what that history is, how it started, and really, how we can move forward, especially away from that history, especially of policing in America.
And Jael, I want to offer you to sort of speak on this question, just because you had brought it up earlier. What do you think the benefit to law enforcement agencies or communities is if officers are equipped with this knowledge and this history?
Well, I think some people are naive to think that some of this stuff started a few hundred years ago or whenever it was, right? Some people sit here and they'll be like, well, this is an issue we're just kind of starting to deal with, right? Our country was built on the backs of Black people, right? Everything we have today, inventions to our healthcare, was built on the backs of Black people, only for it to turn around and disproportionately impact us negatively, right? And that's in all of our systems, right? To Mr. Lee's point, it's in our healthcare system and how Black women are treated and disproportionately die when they're giving birth, right? It's in our education system and how our Black and brown children are disproportionately arrested or suspended in schools. It's everywhere. But the reason I say about this history is some people sit there and will negate what's going on as a matter of something that's happened currently, when in fact it's so embedded in our history and what we do. And so when we're talking about officers who say they want to serve the public good and what they're doing, I get to hold you accountable to that because this is something you've elected into. So I'm going to let you know what you started, where it started. If you haven't taken the time for yourself to understand what you're going into, you should. As someone who's going into finance, I understand what happened at Black Wall Street, right? I know how our markets move. I know who they disproportionately hurt and don't. So when officers sometimes are like, well, this is something I came into just to do X, Y, and Z. Well, I want you to understand where you started and what your job has been and why there is so much mistrust, why we don't want you in our communities. Police in themselves, as a representation of their uniform, do not represent trust to every single community. When people talk about like, let's introduce more police, right? And people are like, well, why wouldn't you want more police? Because that's not trust to everyone. That's not safety to everyone. The uniform itself, we're not talking about the police, the person, I'm talking about the representation of that uniform. And when people look at that, it's mistrust. So when I talk about understanding that history, it's to say, in the role that you choose to be in, elected into, do you understand why the communities respond the way they do if you so call yourself a public servant?
And I did lie. I do want to hit just one more question. And if you want to use this as your closing remarks, feel free to. If it's not relevant, feel free to pass. But something I've been particularly interested in, and Billy Harris touched on in the Q&A, we saw, especially this summer, I mean, Black Lives Matter has been a movement and around for a few years now. And so I'm curious, especially for Aaron and Kevin, you know, this Blue Lives Matter response. Do you see any racial undertones in a slogan like that being created in response to a slogan that was created to promote equity and justice for Black people in America? And where, you know, how do you feel in terms of a Blue Lives or Black Lives thing as you fit into both of those molds?
Aaron, I'll let you take the floor, man.
I struggle a lot with Blue Lives Matter because it's a direct response to Black Lives Matter. So, and it's under that guise and context that, you know, law enforcement, you know, matter as well. When really that it was, you know, it's been advertised as that, you know, law enforcement is better. And so I don't like that term at all, to be honest with you, 100%. I don't think it's the way law enforcement should really going about doing business. So I've also said this before, you know, we're there to serve, and there's going to be people that, you know, don't like the way we do things, don't like the way police officers are, just don't like police in general, and that's fine. But I do feel it's inappropriate for police to, you know, to push back at that. You know, we're there to serve a community, and there's just going to be times where, you know, people aren't going to like you, and it's just part of the job, and it's something as law enforcement we have to deal with.
Really fast, I'm just gonna jump in quickly here. I really struggle with that phrasing, slogan, whatever you want to call it, because somebody gets to take off their uniform at the end of the day. A doctor takes off their white coat, a teacher puts their book away. I, as a student, you might not know if I'm a student or not. Any of these identities we take on as professions, we get to remove at the end of the day if we choose to. As a Black person, there's never a room I walk into and you're not going to see me as a Black person. That just does not exist. So the fact that that was their response to Black Lives Mattering was not only blatantly disrespectful, it's disgusting, right? It's almost to say as if my skin equalizes the profession that you chose to elect into. I'm proud of my Black skin. I'm proud to be a Black woman, right? These are identities I hold. It does not mean in society I'm always viewed that way. And so when people made that, and what's funny almost to me is this slogan was so upheld until we went to the Capitol, right? What happened at the Capitol?
Exactly.
Talk to me about that, because this was so upheld, right, by right-wing extremists so strongly in their hearts to respond to Black Lives Matter. But then we got to the Capitol and it was all law enforcement, all levels of respect and authority. Forget about y'all, we're trying to get in. And we watched it happen. We watched it happen in the media and people said, okay. Right. So to me, it's so disrespectful. It's blatantly hurtful. And I'm thinking back to the protests in which I experienced over the summer and the blatant force I experienced there, and how even before we got to certain places, we were being tear gassed and people were throwing things. And there's this, and how many people came away hurt and harmed by the police in those situations or captured. But then we get to the Capitol and it's all free reign. So that response to the Black Lives Matter movement is just disrespectful. I think I don't take it for anything of value, because it's not, right? Of course it has racial undertones. Of course it's meant to do that. That's what they do, right? Everything is to discredit and remove, right? Turn it into a political movement when people are talking about their lives.
Kevin, did you want to add on anything?
I absolutely could not have said it better. Absolutely not. I'm in lockstep.
I see Dr. Dixon has popped back in here. I don't know if that's because he's telling me, he's clicking his watch at me, or if he has something he would like to contribute. I will give the floor to him though.
Thank you all for having the conversation. We were hoping that it would generate the kind of conversation that's needed to have. But I'll just ask one question, and perhaps this is the most, I can't say that because Jael's been bringing it all night. Love it. Thank you so much. But I'll ask this question. How do you change victimology? You change the victim. So here's my question. If white men and women were being shot down in America's street the way black men and women are being shot down, do you think there would be a problem, there would be a different outcome or a different set of circumstances the way they're being dealt with right now? Anybody can answer that.
I think it goes without saying we know that to be the case. We witnessed what took place at the Capitol. We witnessed what took place when we had Black Lives Matter protesting at the Capitol. It's a different set of circumstances, a different set of rules. This is, unfortunately what America was built on.
Well, of course, right? Like Ms. Leah said, of course that exists. And what's funny to me, if any other sector of society, we saw trends of deaths like this, and we saw a constant issue we had, and people were losing their lives, right? We're not just talking about, even sometimes I hear accountability. I'm like, well, are we gonna not hold people accountable for losing someone's life, right? Like it's even sometimes, it feels almost kind of like, I don't even know how to put it. Like, it's just so crazy to me that we can sit here and discuss someone's life as it's some sort of transaction. Like, I need to hold you accountable because you like almost forgot to do something, right? Not understanding that there was a casualty and a death involved, right? That was someone's brother, someone's husband, someone's boyfriend, whatever it was, but somebody's life was lost. So of course it wouldn't be the same. And we also see that in the same way that law enforcement treats white people today. Right? When we see the Karens of the world who call the police on Black men and Black women disproportionately, and we have a conversation with them, right? No matter how false the accusation was, no matter what recognition that turned into, when what happened to Ahmaud Arbery was that somebody called, right? People assumed that stuff was going on. It wasn't even cause race. People assumed something was going on, but what was the repercussions to them? We heard the audio, we heard the tape. What was the repercussions? So when we're talking about this, of course, it's going to end up that way. Of course, they're going to be supported because those are the very people that uphold their societies as well, right? These are the big donors that continue to influx into their systems, and it continues on and on and on, right? And it gets back into capitalism, and it gets back into how these members uphold society and how it was meant to be upheld for them.
I'm really interested in like Chief Sam and Sheriff Applehands as being not just practitioners, but men, particularly in society as men, and the power that goes along with being a man. And, on top of that, you being a practitioner, a law enforcement practitioner. What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, clerical error, technical error. I think back to some of the conversations that we had last summer, and a couple of folks that I highly respect. Dr. Dixon was also in some of those conversations. And certainly I've learned a lot from him over the last several months. Truly appreciate those opportunities. But we had a bit of an epiphany moment for me in hearing the talk about driving while Black. The conversation that folks have had with their own children, with their own nephew, not a conversation I would have to have with my own offspring, but not something that I had necessarily considered growing up as a Caucasian in Western Nebraska and then transplant to Wyoming. So that power and control issue, that resonated with me, certainly, and from a learning moment. Another one I had was with our now Sheriff Applehands, and this was several years ago. He and I were getting ready to go do some activities in wild Wyoming, and we had a conversation. And this was away from work in a extremely rural area, and it kind of sunk with me. It's like, I'm taking a Black guy out into the woods in the middle of nowhere. I have to worry about his safety. And likewise, he's had to worry about that safety his entire life. So that sunk with me a long time ago, and not long after Aaron started working with us. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like I said, it's just different for some people than it is for other people. Like there's kind of no two ways, ways about it. And so, me taking that, like I said, personally, and then, trying to, like I said, educate other people with it as well. Like I said, it's a lot, and especially coming into this position as well, it's a lot. It's still more that that I have, for me personally, that I have to do. There's certain things that I go through that other people don't go through, both in a law enforcement capacity and in a personal capacity as well. And so it gets to be a lot to try and educate other people, and sometimes share those things with other people about those situations that we have to go through.
Dr. Dixon, did you have any other questions before wrapping up?
No, I think you guys did a great job. Thank you, Timberly. We've had a very busy month, and we've also seen some really great conversations. We've also seen some of the truth of America come out in a momentary fashion that leaves us forever remembering February 15th. And there's a ayat that comes from the Holy Quran that says a reminder always benefits the believer. And I do believe that America is a racist space. And you don't need to be reminded, but we're constantly reminded. So to think about the hard job that you all have to do, and to think about the current atmosphere and then the historical atmosphere that follows policing, where's America headed? Are we headed for a race war? Those are real questions. Are we headed for a space where we won't be able to live together? Because as a Black man, I've lived a second-class citizens type life my entire life. But where do we go from here? Chaos or community? That's what Dr. King said.
I think that's a great last closing remark, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot to answer that question, but I do hope not only the panelists but the attendees not only critically think about that of the main question of where we're going, but I think what we heard repeatedly tonight, we have an institution, and within it there are problems, and we were very vague in talking about problems. And so I think moving forward as a community, in terms of law enforcement officers and people on the other end and community members and activists, we have to not only specifically narrow down what the problems are, we do have to work together to take into the consideration the social context of our communities, and prioritize the people that are struggling the most within our communities and the problems they're facing. And then we need to assess, is this institution of policing something that's been implemented to provide safety, or is under the guise of providing safety and law and order to our community? Is it serving its full purpose? And if not, what can we do to readjust it? And if it is, our problems will then be redirected to other agencies and institutions. And so I thank you all from the bottom of my heart for being here tonight. This was an absolutely fantastic discussion, and seeing all of the questions that are still left in the chat and the comments, I think it's extremely evident that this is the first of many meaningful and important conversations that we need to have, talking about defunding the police and seeing the future of America and the institutions that it was built on, and where we are today and what they need to be readjusted to. And so I thank you all, the panelists, again tonight. And I thank Dr. Dixon and Toby for getting everything together within the Black Studies Center and being so strong this entire month and ensuring that these events went smoothly and were informative. And thank you to the Humanities Institute for co-hosting this Think and Drink. And again, you know, I think what I just want to leave with, this is absolutely imperative that we have these conversations within our communities with all of the people that have stakes in it. And so I hope that you all would be willing to not only continue these conversations within avenues such as this and webinars, but with people you work with the people you live with, and the people that you interact with daily, because that's how you make true community change. So thank you all again for coming tonight, and stay tuned for the Black Studies Center future events. This is our official last event for Black History Month, but we are very early still, not only in our inception, but in producing materials for our community. So thank you all again. Have a great night. And I'm sure we will see you all very soon.